And our presenter today, Anton Nielsen, is an Oracle ace and Vice President Consulting Services at Insum, having joined us in February 2018 when Insum acquired C2 Consulting Incorporated, an Oracle consultation firm out of Boston, of which Anton was also president. Mr. Nielsen has extensive consulting, development, and project management experience with hundreds of clients through work with these two firms, as well as with Oracle and the United States Air Force. Anton is an Oracle ace, as I mentioned, and a frequent presenter at Oracle events. He's received recognitions such as ODTUG Kscope Top Speaker Overall 2015, ODTUG Kscope Top Speaker Apex 2015, and Oracle Consulting Leadership 2000 Award. His specialties are system architecture, database design, project management, application development, reliability modeling and analysis, logistics and optimization, network analysis, and storage architectures. And now let's begin our presentation. Anton, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Mark, and good afternoon, at least to everybody on the East Coast, and good morning if you're farther west. As Mark mentioned, my official title is VP of Consulting Services, but when we merged and joined with Insum earlier this year, they asked me what I wanted my title to be, and I suggested Chief Mentoring Officer. Turns out Insum doesn't really have those kinds of titles, but I retain it as a bit of an aspirational title, because that's really what I like to do and what I've wanted to do as part of this, as part of joining Insum. And really, I've had an opportunity to do that. A lot of what I do these days is work with our consultants to make sure that folks both enjoy what they're doing and get that they give the most that they can to clients. And I participate in projects in making sure that those projects work well for the client and for the folks on the project. And that's really part of what this project is, with this presentation is about forming teams and having those teams work together across not just the developers, but the entire group of teams, business resources, testers, the whole range of folks that are involved in bringing a solution to light. So with that, I'll jump right in and talk a little bit about how it is that teams can develop together. And the first thing I want to talk about is that you are part of a team. And as part of a team, you should agree upon a plan. One of my favorite quotes is from Dwight D. Eisenhower, and that's that plans are worthless, but planning is everything. And really what that is about is you learn a lot from the planning process. As you go through the actual project, you'll run into things that are different than what the plan suggested, and you'll need to adapt and you'll need to make changes. But the process of having done the plan gives you a common language, a common set of expectations in place already, so that it's much easier to make changes to that plan as you go forward. Without any planning at all, you're doomed to be in a quagmire of running in circles and trying to get to a finish without really knowing even where that finish is. The other thing I'll mention is, as I was putting together this presentation and refining it for today, I started thinking about the recommendations within this presentation and which of those apply to large teams or small teams or teams of one. And the reality is, most of what I say today would apply even if you were the only developer working on an application. I'll point out one place where perhaps that's not the case, but the reality is just about everything I say you should take to heart, even if you're just a team of one. So with that, I'll jump right in and talk a little bit about some of the artifacts that a team should put in place for every project. You should have a set of team development practices. And in fact, this presentation focuses on one artifact out of that, and that's your Apex team development practices. But you should have a team directory so that people know how to contact each other. You should use a code repository, and you should talk about how that's done. You should have a documentation so that new people who join the project understand the use of all of these different things and where to find them and what the expectations are. So Out of this list of artifacts that every team should have and every project should have, I'm going to focus on just the Apex team development practices. In other presentations, I'll focus on some of these other areas, but today we're really focusing in on the Apex team development practices. I'll also point out that I've listed these in a particular order. The reality is you should introduce new team members to the team, to the members of the team right away, so that they have somebody to talk to, somebody that they can go to with questions. They should understand the use of your code repository right away, and they should understand the Apex team development best practices right away before they start writing code. Before you give them that environment guide that tells them where to find the dev, test, and production environments, this conversation should be had with any new developers, or really anybody on the team. So that's my recommendation, is that you go through this set of best practices before you even give them that environment guide that gives them the URL to start developing in Apex. So jumping right along, I'm going to focus on 4 use cases. Those 4 use cases are when you're developing completely new functionality, when you're making small, easy changes to an existing page or element of the application, when you experiment without the intent to use, and when you recognize that you're going to have big changes, that you're going to do a full major release of an application, for example, or possibly just that your individual user stories, if you're using the Agile framework, may cross over from one development cycle to another, or one release cycle to another. So these are the areas that I'm going to be focusing in on. And I'll also point out that I'm only focusing in on the Apex application development aspect of it, not backend PL SQL packages, not REST service calls, not a whole host of other things that might be part of your application. I'm specifically going to focus in on Apex and the unique characteristics of Apex that come with this tool. I'll take questions at the end of each of these areas. So as you go along, if you have a question, feel free to type it into the chat, and Mark will select the questions at the end of each of these areas. Okay, so let's jump right in. So completely new functionality. This is the kind of thing that you're going to be creating a new page, and you want to build that within the Apex environment, and you want to make sure that you don't have any problem with other developers or releases to production. You want to make sure that you're building it in a way that it is fundamentally isolated, so that you can do your work without impacting somebody else's work. And if there is a need to promote to production, your new work before it's fully formed doesn't make it into production. And as you all know, Apex is a little bit unique in this regard, in that most of the time you're developing in a shared environment. You all get to log into the same builder environment, and you're doing your building. And to me, this has huge benefits. It actually provides a lot of team continuity. It allows people to see what other people are doing right away. It has a lot of benefits. But it also has this challenge, the challenge of, because you're not separately keeping all the files on your own laptop and then checking them in only when you're ready to have them checked in, there's the possibility that people might step on one another. And that's really what we're focusing in on, is reducing those possibilities of people stepping on each other, or functionality making it into production when it shouldn't make it into production. So when we're talking about new functionality, what are the recommendations? And the biggest recommendation is to build. Now, I mean this in 2 ways. First is, go ahead and build the functionality. You can build it right in the mainline application. It's completely new functionality. It can be isolated from other content. So go ahead and build it. But the other thing that I mean by build is use a build. A build has the capability of isolating your code and not having it appear to exist in the next environment. So there may be folks that don't know what a build is, and I'll go through that in just a moment. But just so that you remember that you should have put a build on it, I'll give you my little Beyonce lyrics. I'm not going to sing them, But my hope is that every time you start creating new functionality, you'll think to yourself that you should have put a build on it. And every time you hear Beyonce's Single Ladies, you'll hate me because now you'll be thinking this as well. So for those of you that really like that song, I apologize. But this is the first thing that you should do, is you should create a build before beginning to do any development for new functionality. You should create that build. So I'm going to go ahead and show you what I mean by that. In the supporting objects area, I'm going to step back for one moment and say, I have 3 windows. I have my PowerPoint, I have a Chrome window that is logged in as my own user, and I'm an administrator of the workspace. And then I have a Firefox window, which if you look at the upper right corner, you can see it says Anton Developer. This is a developer only account. It is not an administrator account. So there'll be reasons that I show this back and forth between these. But to start, I'm going to go into the my mainline. Sorry about that. My mainline application, and I'm going to show how to create a build. So you simply go into Shared Components, you go into Build Options, and you create a build. And what this allows you to do is identify components, tie components to this build so that you can group them together and you can exclude their apparent existence in an environment. So I'll give this my new functionality build. So for example, I might be adding a new about content. So I'm going to add some new about content. I want it to show in this development environment, but I'm not done with it yet. So I may want to exclude it from the upcoming environment. So I'm going to include it in this environment, but I'm going to exclude it from the next environment. And I'll go ahead and create that build option. And now, because I have this new about content, anything that I create, I can tie to this new about content. And in this environment, it will be included. It will exist. But when I export it and I move it to a subsequent environment like test or production, it will appear to not exist. So if I create a new page and I give it the new about content build and I export it and I move it to test, it will appear that that did not exist. So let's go ahead and do that. If I go ahead and into my application and I create a new page. So there we go. I'm going to go ahead and create a new navigation item and I'll click finish. And so I've got my new page. The first thing I'm going to do with my new page is I'm going to go put that build option on it. That's my new about content, and save that page with the new build option. I'll go ahead and run the page. And we've got my new about page. There's nothing here yet. If I add content to this page, that's fine. The one thing I'll point out when we do this is this particular item here is not part of the page. It's part of a navigation entry. So if I were to export this application right now and import it into a subsequent environment, the page 2, would appear not to exist in that environment, but the list item here would exist. So I also want to put that build item on that navigation item. So we'll go to our shared components, navigation menu, and we'll put the build item on that as well. So we'll go into our configuration and we'll apply changes there. So what we've done is created a page and components of that page, list items and so forth, and we've tied them to a build. And what we can do is we can now wholesale decide whether we want all of these features that collectively come together to make this one feature. So list items, navigation items, application processes, whatever it is that goes together to make up this functionality is now bundled against a build, and we can turn that functionality on and off by simply going to the build section under shared components, build options, and we can include it or exclude it. So when we're done with this and we believe we've completed this new functionality, we simply change default on export to include. And then the next time we export the application, it will appear to be included in the import. Now, an interesting thing that is worth noting is that when you set this to export, on export exclude, it still exists in the export file. When you take that export file and you import it into the next environment, all of the content, everything that you've developed moves to that next environment, but the status in the next environment says exclude. So that's the difference, is that this status says exclude, and when we apply changes in the subsequent environment, this page 2, if I were to refresh it, I'll come here and refresh page 2, it will appear not to exist. It says page 2 not found, and that's because the build is set to exclude it. So the runtime application treats it as if it does not exist. It clearly does exist. It just treats it as if it does not. So our build option, we're able to include and exclude based upon this. And we're able to bundle functionality together into a grouping that allows us to turn that on and off. So if I simply come back and refresh again, now it's here. Now, I'm going to stress that I recommend that you create build options based upon groups of functionality. What I sometimes see is a build option that's called include exclude, and it's just used for everything. Every time somebody wants to create something new, they use this include exclude and they apply that build. And then when they're done with their functionality, they go back to the item and they remove the build. The great thing about builds is that they can just always be left on. You can always leave the build associated to a grouping of functionality, and you can just change the include or exclude status. By leaving that functionality together, it's easy to turn it on and off later if you want to. And in particular, it's easy to allow for beta functionality to move to a different environment. What I mean by that is you may have an application that you're shipping to multiple folks, and you want some people to be able to turn that application functionality on in the sense of testing it out, while others you would rather have them leave it off, or you may want to allow them to make the choice themselves. So once you have builds and you've set them to include or exclude within the supporting objects of an application, supporting objects, you can actually allow during the installation process, you can allow users to turn builds on or off. So for example, if I wanted the installer, the person installing the application, to be able to choose whether or not to have this functionality, the new about content functionality, I could click this checkbox and click apply changes. And then during the installation process, they would be prompted whether or not they want that functionality enabled. So builds are very powerful in this way, and I recommend that you use them as a grouping of like functionality so that you can turn it on and off all at once, and that you simply leave the build on the elements and control it using the status of the build. I'm also going to point out a couple other things that I think are worthwhile doing. One is when you are looking at your application itself, you can turn on a couple extra columns. Under actions, columns, you can show additional things. And I always show authorization scheme and build option. And then I save it as my own custom report so that I know where those build options are. I can see that things have build options on them. I'm also going to point out that if you use the blueprint functionality or the feature functionality of creating an application, so if I just go back up very quickly, I'll show you what I'm talking about. When you're creating an application, you have the opportunity to pick different additional features. These features here These features, as you pick them, you'll notice in the application that gets generated, will have builds on them. The reason is that the Apex development team operates in exactly this way. They put builds on things in the exact way that I'm suggesting you do it. They do it by feature, and they do it together. So you can see these pages are all the feedback pages. Those can be turned on and off entirely with a build. Again, activity reporting, that is a set of features, and it has a grouping of builds. The About page has a grouping of builds. So all at once you can turn on and off these features, and that's how the Apex development team builds their sample applications. That's how they build the features that they allow you to import into your application, and that's how they build the Apex builder itself. They use builds in this way so that they can turn features on and off, and if a release is coming up and a feature isn't ready, they can simply exclude it from the build. So that is the content that I recommend for doing any kind of new functionality. So again, that's the first step. Any functionality, the first step is to create a build, and then make sure you put that build on anything that is associated with that set of functionality. Mark, I'll open it up to questions for a couple minutes.
Sure, Anton. We have a question from Richard Soul, who's actually also an employee at InSum. And he asks, any thoughts on making standards for build? Maybe dates, maybe sprints, etc.?
Well, my biggest recommendation is that the standard should have the name of the functionality as the name of the build. If you take a look at the way the Apex team's doing it, they put feature activity reporting. So they understand that this build is associated with a feature. Now, features could potentially span across a release, and that's really a great reason to use them. But my biggest recommendation is that the build name represent a feature. So,
all right, and that's all we have is questions for the moment. So I'll let you continue.
All right. So the next topic is about small, easy changes. What do you do in the case of small, easy changes? Now, you absolutely may consider using builds for this as well, if that small, easy change represents new functionality. So these topics that I'm expressing build upon one another. But the main idea for a small, easy change, this is that you're going to add something to a page. It's something that you're confident that you're going to be able to complete within the sprint cycle. You're going to be able to release it. How do you go about just making a small, easy change? You don't want to have to spend hours doing a bunch of bureaucratic type work just to get ready to add a small new region to a page, for example. So what would you do for a small, easy change? The main thing to do is to lock the page. You don't want to be partway through making your changes and have somebody make an update, and then you update over the top of their changes. This is something that's happened in our group from time to time. It's hard to avoid without locking the page, because people may go in, they have a story that has something relevant on that page as well, and you find out that you got overwritten or you overwrote somebody else's. So small, easy changes. The big key to that is locking the page. However, I recommend that you export the page or the element that you're going to be changing. You do the work on it and you unlock it. The reason to export it is because, of course, plans are worthless. What I mean by that is you may plan to go in and make a really small change and realize partway through, wait, this is bigger than I thought, and I've just goofed something up and I'm not quite sure how to get back. So I'm going to just give a very quick example of that. You could have an about page like they do in this application, and that about page simply has a static region and it has static text on it. So we'll take a quick look here. The text on this is, be sure to lock pages before editing. If I run this page, that's all there is. There's a static region. But your users may have said, we'd really rather source the content that goes in here from our from an environments table or a contents table where we're going to type things in. And so they say, we've already got screens for putting the content in. We just want to essentially use a select statement to get the content out. So we've got a webinar content table. We've got the content cloud table. And if we simply select this out, we can get this, and we would have this page tells all about the application. So it would be very easy to grab that select statement, come to our page, create a new region of classic report, put it in there, make it a SQL query, put in our query, save that, make sure that it compiles. It makes it through the checker. Yep, that's great. So now I'm going to delete my about page. I'll save that. I'll run it. And it looks like I've already made a mistake. It seems like the easiest thing in the world. I should have been able to simply do this, but now there's a problem. I've created a new region. I deleted the old region, and my new region doesn't work. It's possible I could solve this right away, but it might be something that I realize, wait a minute, I want to go back to where I was. The problem is that I didn't lock the page. I didn't export the page. Even for the smallest things, it always makes sense to lock the page and export it, and so that you'll have the possibility to import it. And it only takes an instant to do it. Fortunately, I actually have an import of that page. So I'm going to go ahead back to my application. I have an export of that page. I'm going to go back. I'm going to import it. I'll choose this file. And I'll install the page. Replace the existing page. Great. We'll run the page, and we're back to where we were. So this is good. So what should we do? That's really the question. So what we should do is we should first lock the page. Then export the page. And then make our changes to the page. So I've added about 30 seconds by locking and exporting the page to my work, but it's definitely worthwhile to get a copy of that so that if you do make a change and that you don't like it, you can bring it back. But more importantly, you've now locked the page. If another user wants to make a change to the page, and I'm going to go ahead and show here, I'm logged in as a different user. You'll see that that user will see a lock icon on the page. And so it'll be indicated that that page is locked. They can still look at that page. So this developer can take a look at the page. But it'll have an indication that the page is locked, who it's locked by. And if they click on it, they'll be able to get the comments that you've put in there of what you're working on. So they'll know that you're working on it and that they have to wait so that you don't step on each other as you're working on it. Now, individual developers can only unlock their own pages. Workspace administrators can unlock any page. So you want to limit who your administrators are to a workspace, but you want to at least have somebody available to unlock a page in case somebody goes home or goes on vacation and forgets to unlock a page. I can tell you in our group, you only have to forget to unlock a page once or twice before you realize that doesn't go over very well. People get aggravated when they come back day after day and the pages are just continually locked. So you'll get a phone call from somebody for sure if you leave it locked all the time. But I would rather have people lock pages when they shouldn't and forget than not lock them at all. So locking pages are really, really important. So that's the small, easy changes. Any questions, Mark?
Yeah, we have one question, which is from Hansen Pretorius, and he asks, is there a way to auto-lock the page? Whoops, I just lost the question. It just popped off my screen here.
That's a great idea. There's not one that I'm aware of, but I think that would be great. As soon as you start working on a page, if you were to make a change, have the page lock. It would be the equivalent of pessimistic locking in the sense of database pessimistic locking, but there is not a way that I'm aware of to lock a page. And that also brings up the point that there's not a way to lock a lot of other components. Shared components, you can't lock them. You can only lock pages. So the other kinds of content are more challenging if you're doing a lot of work with application level constructs, such as application processes, application items, computations. Those kinds of things can't be locked, but they can be individually exported. So I'll spend just one moment to cover that. Even though it's not exactly as the question was, but when you go to export here, you can choose, when you get to the export screen, to do a component export. So if you know you're going to be working on a series of components or an individual component, you can go here and select the component or components that you're going to be working on and add those to an export file and export that, just in case you really goof something up and you want to be able to recreate those particular pieces. You can export a set of components. So there we go. That's the steps to export a set of components.
And
So,
I think we were going to have another question from Abhilash. So here it comes. If the same user ID, if same user ID being used by different users, how to handle it?
The way to handle that is not to do it. You should always create separate user accounts for your separate developers. So if you have 10 developers on the team, you should have 10 developer accounts. It's just never a good idea to share accounts. That's just my answer. There's no downside at all to having everyone have their own account.
All right, and that's all our questions for now.
Great. So the next thing I'll say is, as I talked about, small, easy changes sometimes turn into much bigger changes, and you realize that you're not quite sure how to do something. You're not confident that you're going to be able to do it the first try. You want to experiment. You want to play around. Whatever you're about to do, you know that you're not going to go forward with this experiment. It's going to be throwaway, and you're going to rebuild it. And so you don't want to do that in your mainline application. The easiest way to do that is simply make a copy of the application. Copy your Apex application and do all of your experimenting in the copy. The main recommendation I have when you're doing this, you copy the application. It's very easy to do. You come in to your application. You copy this application, give it a name. The key here, though, put your name in the new application name, preferably in the front. The reason that you want to do this, the reason you want to put your name there is that people will be coming in to do editing of this application. Your coworkers, your teammates will be coming in to the application builder, and you don't want them to accidentally do a lot of work in the wrong application. If I go up to the application builder, it's now clear that this is Anton's application and this is the main real application. And if Neil Shaw were to come in and he's on my team and he comes to this screen, he's very unlikely to pick this and start working. He'll recognize that this is not the right application and he'll pick this one. Admittedly, the application ID could be an indicator, but it's a whole lot easier if you just put your name on it. And then when you're done with your experimentation, you can delete your application and you can get rid of it. And you know which one you're getting rid of. You don't want to delete the mainline application. You just delete your own application. It's a small thing, but it's very important to communicate that when people make copies of the application, to put their name on it. So now we're going to get in the meat of things. The meat of this is big changes. When you've got a full new release coming out, or when you've got a change that you are confident or even you're concerned might be big enough that it slides into the next release. If you're doing a Scrum or Agile methodology, you may be having releases every 2 weeks, 3 weeks, 4 weeks. It can be difficult to be sure that you're going to have something. And you want to have a way to make big changes that you can later bring back into the application, but not necessarily have them all have to be done in that mainline application. So we'll spend a little bit of time talking about this, but the idea is that you want to be able to clone the application that everybody's working in. You want to be able to build in the clone. And so in order to clone and build, and then you want to be able to export your changes and import them back into the mainline application. And the reason that you want to be able to do this is that you want to be able to actually work on some of the specific components and not actually have the underlying IDs change. So let's say, for example, you're going to be making changes to a number of interactive reports. And those interactive reports are already in production. People are using them in production. They're making changes to them. They're saving their own versions of those within the application. They may have subscriptions to that interactive report. So you want to make sure that you don't lose all of those kinds of things. If you were to simply create a new interactive report on the same page, make all the changes to the new interactive report, and delete the old interactive report, all of those subscriptions would get deleted. All of their saved formats and saved filters would get deleted. Those kinds of things are the reasons that you want to maintain those underlying IDs. And the other reason is you don't want to get halfway through making a big change to an application and realize that it's going to go to the next release and you're not done. So clone, build, export, import is an important capability to be able to have as a developer. How you do this is you get your own database and your own Apex install and you clone that environment. I'm going to repeat it again. You need your own damn environment. I'm not usually that strong. I don't usually use such strong languages, but I really feel this way about it. You need your own environment, and you need it right now. Right now. You don't need it when you realize you need it. You need it at the beginning of the project so that when you need it, it's already there. What this means is that every Apex developer should know how to have a full Apex installation on their personal desktop or laptop computer. And not everybody wants to do this, but I really believe that every Apex developer should have their own environment that they're able to do this with. And they should have it now so that when they need it, they have it available. And I know in some environments, you're not going to be able to do everything I'm talking about. You're not going to be able to do a complete clone of all the data. You're not going to be able to do a complete clone of everything, but the benefits of being able to do at least pieces of what I'm talking about, even in the most strict environments, is very beneficial for any Apex developer. So I'm going to walk you through some steps as to what I think you should be able to do as an Apex developer to the extent that your organization allows it. So you have several options on how to have your own environment. One is to run a virtual machine on your desktop or your laptop. I give URLs in this presentation to the images and exactly how you can do that. So that's explained in the next slide. You could use a pluggable database. You could ask your DBA, hey, can you clone our development environment for me right now and give me the URL to that clone? So that's certainly another option, and that should be an option that for really strict organizations that don't want you to make a clone onto your laptop, that would be another option, is to get your DBA to have a pluggable database that they can spin up very quickly for you to make changes in and play in. And when you're ready, you can move those back in. You could use a Docker image. You could use Oracle XE. And Oracle 18 is committed to having an XE based upon Enterprise Edition that should be able to run on a reasonable sized machine and be a much easier install than, and it's free. Oracle XE is free. So whatever option you as a group decide, I recommend that you make that decision as a team, and that every developer in the team do this and have this up and available for them, so that they're able to make use of their own environment when they need to, and before they need to. We have it up and running now, because planning is everything. So these URLs will give you a full virtual machine and a full virtual box with the Apex development environment up and running on it. There's a lot of instruction at these two URLs. So from there, you can bring up an entire Oracle REST data services and Apex environment. That will get you Apex up and running. From there, you need to actually get your application and your database schema. So before I get to there, if you do this and you run this environment, you need to make a couple of changes in your virtual box manager. You need to increase your base memory to 3 gig. If you don't do that, things aren't going to run. If you have a lot of memory, you could go higher than that, but you need a minimum of 3 gig. And you need to configure your SSH port. So if you're going to use the URLs in this, these would be the only things that you need to do to get it up and running. There are plenty of other ways to do it via Docker or a pluggable database. I'm not going to go through all the steps in those. Then you need to clone that database that you're working with. Now, you don't necessarily need to clone the whole database. You could clone just a particular schema, or you can clone the entire database. So a couple options. One is to clone the entire database and move it over into your virtual box. So you can follow this link right here to all of the steps of what you would need to do to clone an Oracle database with Apex, the steps of cloning it, and what you want to do in order to make sure that nothing bad happens when you make that clone. And again, all of the steps are here, so I'm not going to go through it. The other option is to just clone the particular workspace that you're working in. So here you would want to confirm your Apex version. So you've got your mainline database that everybody's working in, and you've got yours on your laptop or your virtual box. Step 1 is confirm Apex versions, make sure that you have the right version. The next step is to clone the schema that your workspace is associated with. This URL will walk you through completely cloning an Oracle schema. You can export and import the workspace, export and import the application. If you take these steps, you will then have a full working environment. Again, I understand that some organizations don't want you to clone the databases onto your local machine. You have several options: cloning the database, cloning just the schema and not the actual data, or working with the DBAs to get a pluggable database on the development environment that you have. Whichever of these options you choose, you should have this practiced, and you should do this as part of the beginnings of your project so that everyone can do this when they need to. Let's see. So once you've cloned the database, the next thing to do is to do your work in your environment. So you're going to do the work on there. As you go into your environment, though, you're going to be working on pages and on components that people may be working on in the mainline environment. This is where communication comes into play. You need to let your team know that you're doing offline work. You can do this by locking pages. You can do this during your daily stand-ups if you're doing an Agile Scrum. You can do it via email if you have to, but that's perhaps the worst way to do it. But what you do need to do is anytime you come into your own environment and you're developing offline, you need to make sure that the rest of the team understands that you're going to be doing work offline that you're going to be bringing back into the mainline code. I definitely recommend that if you're making changes to pages, you lock those pages so that people don't lose their work. If you're working on, and when you bring the code back, which you're going to have to do, you should check to see that the components haven't changed, that nobody's made a change to a component that you're about to bring back. So you've done your work offline. You'll do a component export like I demonstrated before. I'm going to come back here and show you again. After you've done your work and you've made changes, you'll come back. You'll do a component export. Pick the elements that you wish to export. So I'll pick a few elements here that I'm going to export. And now that I've generated my export file, I need to check to make sure that these components have not been changed in the mainline application. If they have, you're going to have to check with what those changes were to make sure that you're not overwriting somebody else's changes. So the idea is to lock the pages, export the repository and the schema, make your changes, and then bring it back. And you do have to be careful. I'm going to point out that also, I'm really talking about Apex at this point. I'm not talking about all the standard PL SQL code that you'd be doing within the database. You have to continue to use your PL SQL code repository tools for that kind of work. They're great, between Git and Subversion. You've got great tools for doing PL SQL code repository. I'm really talking about specifically the Apex application building. So that, in essence, is the hardest piece. The easy changes and the experimentation and new code, those are all easy. This last option, when you're doing a big change, clone, build, export, import, and have that capability before you need it. That's the word that I'm going to leave it with. So Mark, if there are any questions, I'm happy to take questions on this content as well.
Yeah, absolutely. There's been a few questions on this section.
Sure.
The first one being, can we, there's a lot going on here, sorry. I'll back up here, one moment. Can we import, export multiple applications at once? And this is a question from Ayman Hassan.
You can. There is a utility if you want to use the command line level utilities for exporting applications. You can export and import multiple applications at once using the command line, not through the Apex GUI though.
Okay. From Akshay Jawanjal, we have a question, which is, can we export schema of Apex 4.0/5.1 to 18.1?
So what you would, so there's two aspects of it. Your workspace schema, you can export and import using a host of export import choices. So for the workspace schema that has your own tables, your own data, you would do just any kind of export import. To move from an application that's in Apex 4 to Apex 18.1, I'm about 90% sure that you can just go from 4 to 18.1 by doing an export from 4 and an import to 18.1. You cannot go from 3 to 18.1. I know that. It's possible you would have to go from 4 to 5, but I'm pretty sure that we've done a 4 to 18.1. I'm just not 100% sure.
Okay. We have a question from Jürgen Schuster, who asks, how do I find out if the components have been changed?
That's a great question. So it's when you look at the components, if we go back up to the application, most components have the last update by. So if we go back in here, so if we go into shared components and we pick up, for example, application items, I don't have any application items. Let me create one. Hopefully this will have created by, this one, there we go, updated column. Yes, there we have. So the updated column will have a date. So the last time items were updated. It is difficult because if you're going to do this, if you're going to make these kinds of big changes, you end up, when you bring it back, having to go through and take a look at the updated column of every element that you're bringing back, particularly if it's not a page that you've locked. If it's a page that you've locked, that's not an issue. But if it's anything other than a page that's been locked, you do want to come through and look at that. And I think every shared component will have an updated column. Excuse me. I will point out one other thing though, that you can't actually import a page that is currently locked, even if it's locked by you. If I come in here and I lock this page, I would not be able to, and then if I export it, I have to unlock it before I can import it again. So I'll just show very quickly what will happen. So I've made that export. I come back to my application and I do a component-based import. It will tell me that I can't do it because the page is locked. So you do have to go through and unlock the pages prior. And you can see the page is currently locked. You cannot import an overlocked page, even if you're the person who locked it.
Okay. Yep. Ayman Hassan asks also, can we make application/page comparisons or comparison between two applications in two different workspaces, development and production?
Excellent. So there's a lot going on with that question, but there are a couple of compare utilities out there that people are working out to be able to compare exports of pages. Personally, I try to make sure that I've got the same application, the same workspace ID across dev, test, and production. It makes things a lot easier in this regard. So when you establish your development environment, you can export your workspace and import your workspace into test and into production. Or when you create your workspace in test and you create your workspace in production, you can create it with the same underlying workspace ID. When you do that, it allows you to import the application into each environment with the same ID. So you export application 123 out of dev, you import 123 into test. All of the underlying IDs remain the same. And what that allows you to do is you can export two components, you can get the SQL files, and you can use any kind of a code editor to compare these SQL files. Now, they're not really easy to understand, but you can. I'll pull one up here just so you can see what an export file looks like. So this is an export file. You can use any code editor to compare the export files and see if there's something different. Really, that's the best answer I have right now. There are folks that are working on compare utilities, though. So the next one.
Yep. This question comes from Rafael Moreno. And the question is, working in a group of developers, how can we organize to use source control?
So so I am fully in support of using source control for both PL/SQL and for Apex and any other JavaScript or CSS files or anything else that you have. The challenge is that Apex itself isn't file-based. The other things, your PL/SQL, your JavaScript files, your CSS, you can use all this just the standard functionality for checking in that kind of code. When it comes to the Apex application itself, I recommend that you use the Java-based utilities for doing automated exports of your application every night and having that export checked into your source control program. You can automate that using Jenkins and Hudson. But that's really my recommendation, is that you simply check in your Apex application every night so that you have an export of that application. There's not a good way today to do sort of the file-based check-in that you do with other components of your application. The Apex export is really the best that we have.
Okay, our next question is from Andre Pear. What is the best way to move a page to a different workspace without copying the whole application?
Yes, so if you want to move a page, and I guess it depends on if you're just looking to move a page to a different workspace, or if you're looking to move a page to, up through your development, test, production cycle. If you're looking to move it up through your development, test, production cycle, you can simply go to the page, export the page, and import it into the next environment. So you would simply pick the page or the components that you want and do an export. So and do an export of the page. Now, if you want to move it to a workspace that doesn't already have this application in it, then you do have to export the whole application and move and import the whole application into the other workspace. And then you can copy it from one application to another at that point. But the only way to get a page moved into a workspace is for the application to be in that workspace that the page was exported from.
All right. The next question I'm going to ask is, I think is Jürgen Schuster has put two of them together, I believe. Correct me if I'm wrong, but the question is, anything generic I could do through the repository, followed by checking objects. I'm going to update and run a report against the rep to find out if any object has a newer date.
So I think what you're going to doing is giving me a little bit of advice, and that's great. One of the beauties of Apex is that it is in fact metadata driven, and so if you don't want to go through the application user interface, for example, and look at every element that's changed in your shared components by clicking through and looking all of them this way, I just created an item, sorry. If you don't want to have to go this way to look, you can certainly write queries against the metadata repository to see if things have changed. So instead of having to go through the user interface and look at everything through the user interface, you can go and write your own queries to see every element that's changed in a particular time frame. So I think that's a great idea. Jürgen, I don't know if you have pre-canned queries for some of these, but it would be certainly something that actually somewhere I have a view that pulls out just the name, the item type, and the last updated by that we created at one point. So that's something that could easily be done. And really in answer to the question as well about how you could compare two applications, as opposed to using an editor, you could create a database link, for example, and run queries against the underlying database Apex views. So.
All right. I'm going to skip back to a comment from Abhilash, and he mentions comments play a good role in versioning, but comments result in taking extra space in code editors. Any ideas on that?
My idea is that the extra space is well worth it. I'm a big fan of comment first, then write your code, and the more the better. Space is cheap. I can't imagine the cost of storage is a problem. And for me, the extra comments are always better.
All right. Jürgen Schuster again mentions also, when do you consider a change as a big change to justify this process?
And that's a big question, Jürgen. The best answer I have is if you've already got the environment up and running and you've done that and it's ready for you, you'll be willing to undertake that for smaller changes. And you'll be willing to undertake it. For example, if you just want to get some work done on a flight, you're flying to Moscow and you're going to have 8 hours on a plane without Wi-Fi. You'll consider doing it under that circumstance as well. So the reality is, once you have this environment and you're comfortable running through this larger process, you're more comfortable doing it with smaller changes, and it doesn't become such a burden. And so what really drives it for me are two scenarios. One is that I think that I anticipate that there's some chance that I'm not going to complete my work before the window of opportunity to get it in the next release. That's the key. So in some cases, that next release is a month off. So it could be a fairly large effort that would require me to make this change. In some cases, the next release is 2 days off. So it's a much smaller window. But the other scenario is quite literally, if I'm about to be on a disconnected mode, but I want to get some work done, I may undertake this process even if I wouldn't otherwise, just because I have this environment up and running, it's easy for me to do, and I want to get an extra 3 hours of work in on my flight, to Chicago.
I think I've got another comment from Abhilash, who mentions that by extra space he meant that normally JavaScript code editors in Apex only accept a maximum of 2,000 characters.
Yeah, okay, yeah, the JavaScript editor. Yeah, no, I understand. My response there is that, generally speaking, if you're writing enough code to go beyond the capability of the editor within Apex, that code should be file-based code and not within Apex itself. And that's true whether it's JavaScript or PL SQL or CSS. Anywhere that you find yourself going beyond the content that's capable of residing within the Apex itself, you are almost certainly would be better served by putting it in some sort of file-based repository or within PL SQL.
Okay. Abhilash also asks, can we track the new code changes that have been done to a page or an application?
Well, there's some history within the Apex builder itself. You can take a look at the history if you go to a page. And a lot of folks aren't quite all that aware of it, but within the little tools here, there is a history, and you can click there and you can see who has made changes and what the changes were relevant to. You don't really see the details of the change, but you can see sort of a history that this page has had multiple changes in the last day or whatever the time period might be.
All right. Akshay Jawanjal asks also, can we get back a page deleted by a developer by mistake?
Yes, you can. That's a great question. So you can, if you do it quickly, or depending on your database environment. What you can do is you can export an application as of a certain time ago. So if I go to my application export, there's this field here, export as of so many minutes ago. I recommend that you click the help on that. Well, the help doesn't seem to be, my page is no longer responding, but what that allows you to do is you can put in a number of minutes ago. So if the person deleted the page 20 minutes ago, you could put in 30 minutes, export the application, import the application again, and you would have it. And you could import it as a different ID, for example, and then copy the page back in, whatever makes sense there, but you can absolutely get it back in this way. This relies on the database's flashback data archive settings. So depending on the database, it may be set up to have a certain amount of space or a certain amount of time that it will allow you to do this. You can, your DBAs can set this up. I recommend in your development environment that you do set it on a fairly high level, depending on how much space that you have, So I would work with your DBAs to get that flashback data archive set as high as they're comfortable with, so that you can go back in time like this.
Great. We'll take one last question, and this one is from Ayman Hassan. Can we define a release with all its related pages? Then can we move the whole release from one environment to another?
That's great. You could do that. Generally speaking, if you're doing a release like that, I recommend exporting the whole application and importing the whole application. That said, there are cases where you don't want to do that, or you may have a very large application. In those scenarios, you can certainly do a component level export. One of the nice things about the component level export, I'm going to switch over here because that one has died. The component level export will allow you to sort them by things that have changed recently. So if I come to my export, I can sort by the last time things were updated. So you can pretty quickly see when things were updated and choose the things that were updated most recently in order to get it. But those are your two options. You can move forward the whole application, or you can do a component level and pick the components that have changed.
All right, so that pretty well sums up our webinar for today. We had a few questions from Jesus Moreno Diaz, who has left the session, and we'll be answering those by email. And if you have any additional questions, please don't hesitate and email us at webinar@insum.ca, and we'll be very happy to answer you. So this concludes our presentation for today, and I forgot to mention that a recording of the presentation will be made available, and if you'd like to access it, please email it at the address I mentioned, webinar@insum.ca, and we'll send you a link. Any closing remarks, Anton?
Just thank you very much for attending, and I look forward to hearing from anyone that has questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Anton, very much for that presentation and all those answers. Thank you very much. And on behalf of everyone at INSUM, thank you for your time, and we really hope to see you soon. Goodbye.